today that Pete Hegseth has done is denying that allegation of sexual assault. That was kind of one of the first things that came up after Trump picked him to be his defense secretary. He has denied it fervently. It was settled in an agreement with this woman in 2017. Yesterday, when you were talking to Jake Tapper, you said that you believed it's extortion. But of course, as you know, extortion is also a crime. So if you felt that it was extortion, why not go to the police at the time?
Well, it was a decision that we made, and the email from the attorney. It was something that I don't know if it quite rises to the level of a criminal extortion that the police would take it on, but I think it certainly does meet the definition under the California law for civil extortion, and it was something that we were considering at the time. And quite frankly, with the violation of the agreement, if he is not confirmed as the Secretary of Defense, we may still bring a civil extortion claim against her.
So if he is not ultimately confirmed because of these allegations, you may take legal action against the person at the center of that agreement.
Absolutely. If the false claims of somebody that was part of an extortion that was then put out in violation of a settlement agreement ultimately causes him to lose his future employment opportunities, then yes, that is something that is worth bringing a lawsuit against her and her friend and potentially even the attorney for, yes.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, that was Pete Hegseth's attorney, Timothy Parlatore, basically saying on air that if Pete Hegseth isn't ultimately confirmed as Secretary of Defense, that there is then a basis for his attorney to bring a civil extortion suit against the woman who initially brought these claims up against Pete Hegseth in the first place. So first off, is there a basis for a civil extortion suit against this woman?
Brian, it's tough to tell because I listened to what Pete Hegseth's lawyer, Tim Parlatore, was saying. I also went back and read up on some of the information about the original alleged sexual assault back in 2017 in California. It is very hard for this old career prosecutor to make heads or tails of what Tim Parlatore is claiming. But let's do this one by the numbers. Back in October of 2017, this alleged victim, a woman whose name has not been released publicly, reported to the police that she had been sexually assaulted by Pete Hegseth. This was out in Monterey, California. She also went through a sexual assault examination, so it, at least on the surface, seemed to be a serious claim that was being alleged against Pete Hegseth. Now, the police opted not to go forward with the case, or the prosecutors ultimately opted not to go forward with the case. However, in 2020, the reporting goes, this alleged victim, was talking about maybe bringing a civil suit for the alleged sexual assault against Hegseth. And Pete Hegseth decided to avoid that by negotiating a settlement with this woman and paying her money, presumably not to either pursue the litigation or talk about perhaps what had happened. Now, this was not an NDA, not a non-disclosure agreement. This was what's called a confidential settlement agreement, at least according to Tim Parlatore, Hegseth's lawyer. Here we are, 4 years later, and all of a sudden, Hegseth's lawyer is saying, well, we may have to bring an extortion case, a civil suit for extortion against this woman if Hegseth is not confirmed as the Secretary of Defense. Now, wait a minute. First of all, this woman reported it to the police in 2017, within days of it allegedly happening. So she's already reported it out to the authorities. Then there was a negotiated settlement agreement in 2020. Presumably both parties were represented by lawyers. So how any of this is extortion? What's extortion, Brian? Well, under the laws of California, there's criminal extortion and there's civil extortion. Criminal extortion is Brian, if you don't pay me $1 million, I'm going to burn down your house. That would be me trying to criminally extort money out of you by threatening to do something I have no legal right to do. Now, civil extortion can be more nuanced, like, hey, I found out that you're cheating on your wife, and I may have to tell your wife if you don't, maybe pay me to be quiet. That could be a criminal extortion, but it also feels more like a civil extortion. And when there's a civil extortion going on, one party can sue the other if you try to wrongfully extort money out of me. So if any of this actually happened, it would have been the subject of something in 2017 or maybe something in 2020, all of which leads me to sense, Brian, that there was no extortion going on at all. This is Pete Hegseth and his lawyer now, it seems, trying to chill this woman from continuing to talk about what she claims Pete Hegseth did to her back in 2017. And don't take my word for it. Senator Blumenthal just went on record and addressed this and said, this actually sounds like it could be witness tampering, like Pete Hegseth's lawyer threatening this woman with what doesn't seem to be a well-founded civil extortion suit if she doesn't keep her mouth quiet. And if that's not complicated enough, Brian, one of the things Tim Parlatore said, and remember, Tim Parlatore also used to represent Donald Trump in the classified documents case. Now he represents Pete Hegseth. What he also said is, well, there never was a non-disclosure agreement. There was a confidential settlement agreement, but that has been breached. That's been violated. So now this woman, this alleged victim, is allowed to talk as much as she wants as long as she doesn't lie. So all of this kind of begs the question, where does it leave the American people with respect to what information they can expect during a Pete Hegseth confirmation hearing, if any, if he doesn't withdraw his name well in advance of any hearing? And the question becomes, could this woman testify publicly at a Senate confirmation hearing? And the answer is, you bet she can, because even if there was a confidential settlement agreement, even if there was an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, guess what? A lawful subpoena trumps all that, no pun intended, and this woman could be compelled to testify. So all of this is a great big mess. I don't know what to credit that Tim Parlatore is saying on behalf of Pete Hegseth, but none of it sounds all that plausible to me.
Glenn, is it my understanding that by virtue of Timothy Parlatore and the rest of Pete Hegseth's legal team basically presenting themselves as the victim and claiming that they're the victims of extortion here, that in reality they might actually be setting themselves up for a witness intimidation charge on their own behalf by virtue of what they're doing?
Absolutely. If the evidence supports that they're actually wrongfully trying to intimidate this woman into silence by claiming that she was trying to extort them when she wasn't. And one of the things I find, two of the things I find most compelling that cut against any kind of an extortion claim, criminal or civil, is one, she reported it to the police. So it was already out there, publicly reported shortly after it happened in 2017. So how could she then later hang it over Pete Hegseth's head if there was also already a police report in existence documenting her claim? And then in 2020, 3 years later, when the parties negotiated a confidential settlement to kind of keep her from talking about it, anymore, how does that feel like extortion if you have this negotiated agreement and attorneys are representing the two parties to this negotiated confidentiality settlement? If Pete Hegseth and his lawyer at that moment were of the belief, wait a minute, you're trying to extort me, kind of sounds like maybe they would have reported that to the authorities, or maybe they would have filed a civil extortion claim against the woman. That's why I say, Brian, when you look at this, it just all kind of falls under the weight of its own frivolity.
So, Glenn, basically, Timothy Parlatore is trying to concoct out of thin air, an imaginary civil charge, but by virtue of doing that, he's actually creating an actual criminal charge? Is that what's happening here?
If the evidence supports it, witness intimidation is a criminal offense, and it could actually be a criminal offense in violation of federal law, which would make it prosecutable by whom? The U.S. Department of Justice, or it might also violate state law, which means it could be violating D.C. statutes if that's where the witness intimidation is actually unfolding. And one of the things moving forward, Brian, and I know you wanted a quick yes or no answer, one of the things that I think we're going to have to keep our eye on, particularly once Donald Trump is sworn in and, finds an attorney general to perhaps do his bidding, then I think we're going to have to look at, okay, is whatever's going on a violation of federal law? Because if so, Donald Trump might not want his Justice Department to pursue it. Or is it a violation of state law? And that's why I think state prosecutors around the country are going to have to perhaps begin to pick up the slack if Donald Trump really does follow through on his attempts to corrupt and weaponize the Department of Justice to go after his perceived enemies.
Well, yeah, Glenn, that's the sad irony of all of this is that if there is a federal charge that's born out of this against Pete Hegseth for witness intimidation, isn't it true that basically Donald Trump's DOJ could just step in and kill it on Pete Hegseth's behalf?
Yeah, it's a sad irony and a really dangerous circumstance for the rule of law, because if Donald Trump follows through on his threat to corrupt and weaponize the Department of Justice, then I think we have relatively little hope that the rule of law will be applied aggressively against somebody like Pete Hegseth in the event he and or his lawyer are involved in potential criminal wrongdoing. And that's why I say the state prosecutors are going to have to step up, because if you intimidate or tamper with a witness, you may commit not only a federal offense, but you may also be violating local state law, or if it happens in Washington, D.C., local D.C. city criminal statutes, because D.C. is not a state. So, I do think all law enforcement agencies are going to have to potentially step up their game if Donald Trump makes good on his threat to corrupt and weaponize the Department of Justice.
All right, well, obviously this is very much an open case here in terms of both what Pete Hegseth is going to try to do with this bogus claim of extortion for something that happened in 2017 that's already been basically adjudicated, and also the potential for a witness intimidation charge against Pete Hegseth himself for what he's doing right now. So again, a very open question. It remains to be seen what happens here, but we'll continue to cover it moving forward. For those of you who are watching right now, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. That's the best way to stay on top of this and to support independent media more broadly. So again, the links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.